I have been inside a room where something ancient and evil spoke directly to me, not through a dream, not through a vision, in person, face to face. I have performed hundreds of exorcisms. I have stood in rooms that smelled like sulfur, rooms where grown men were lifted off the floor by forces no human being could explain. I have held down people who moments before were completely normal and watched their eyes go black, completely black. No iris, no white, just darkness staring back at me. But there was one night, one specific exorcism that changed everything for me. Not because of what the demon did to the person on the table, but because of what it said to me. Called me by my baptismal name, a name that is not public, a name that only God and I know. And then it told me something about my past, something so specific, so private, so deeply buried, that I dropped the ritual book right there in the middle of the rite that night. I learned something that every Catholic priest who has ever performed an exorcism eventually discovers. These things know you. They have been watching you for years. And if you are watching this right now, if you think this topic doesn't concern you, you need to understand one thing before we go any further. The demonic doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. It believes in you. Stay with me because what I'm about to tell you is something that most priests will never say publicly, but someone has to. And I'm not afraid anymore. Let's begin. My name is Chad Ripper. I am a Catholic priest, a toistic philosopher, one of the very few formally trained exorcists still operating in the Western world today. I did not choose this ministry. This ministry chose me, and once it does, there is no going back. When I entered seminary, I was a serious student. I wanted to understand theology at the deepest level possible. I studied St. Thomas Aquinas. I studied metaphysics. I studied the nature of the soul rarely here. I was the kind of man who believed that faith and reason properly ordered could answer almost any question, and then I encountered my first real possession case. Nothing, and I mean nothing, that I had read in any textbook, any theological treatise, or any account of church history had prepared me for what I witnessed. Not the sounds, not the strength, not the knowledge that thing had about the priest standing in front of it. People today think exorcism is a Hollywood drama. They think it's a priest holding up a crucifix while a girl spins her head around. They think it's theatrical. They think it's metaphorical. It is none of those things. The real rite of exorcism is brutal, grinding, exhausting work. It can take hours. It can take sessions that stretch across days. I have been in rooms where the temperature dropped so fast that you could see your breath in July in Texas. I have watched a 90-pound woman snap restraints that were rated for 500 pounds. I have heard voices come from a human throat that no human throat can produce. Simultaneous voices. One low and ancient, one high and mocking, speaking at the same time from the same mouth. But what truly unsettled me, what still unsettles me today, is not the physical phenomena. It is the intelligence. Demons are not animals. They are not mindless creatures lashing out in the dark. They are beings of pure intellect, fallen intellect, corrupted and twisted, but intellect nonetheless. They think, they plan, they deceive with extraordinary sophistication, and they have been doing it for longer than the human race has existed. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us that angels and fallen angels are still angels in terms of their essential nature, possess an intelligence that operates without the limitations of the human brain. They do not learn slowly, one piece at a time, as we do. They know things whole all at once. This is why a demon that has been attached to a family line for 4 generations knows things about that family that no human investigator could uncover. It was there, it watched, it filed it away, it waits. In my first major case, the possessed individual was a middle-aged man. I won't give details that would identify him, but I will tell you that when I entered the room and began the preliminary prayers, the thing inside him turned its head slowly, mechanically, and looked at me with eyes that had gone completely flat. Not angry, not afraid, just assessing. And it said in Latin with perfect classical pronunciation, "We know why you're afraid of enclosed spaces, Father." I had never told that to a single person in my life. Not my spiritual director, not my bishop. Something from my childhood, a specific incident, a specific place that I had buried so deeply I had nearly forgotten it myself. I kept praying, but inside I understood in that moment that I was not dealing with a sick man's subconscious. I was not dealing with a psychological phenomenon. I was dealing with a person, a non-human person who had accessed something in me that had no business being accessible. That is the first thing you need to understand about the demonic. It knows your wounds. It targets them. It uses them. And if you have not done the spiritual work of healing those wounds through confession, prayer, and the sacraments, you are walking around with a roadmap of vulnerabilities that these entities can read like a file. I did not become a fully authorized exorcist overnight. The church takes this seriously, or at least it is supposed to. Full authorization to perform the solemn rite requires explicit permission from a bishop. The church has this protocol for good reason, because inexperienced priests going into these cases without proper formation are not just ineffective. They are dangerous to themselves and to the people they are trying to help. Well, I have cleaned up the wreckage of amateur exorcisms gone wrong, where I have worked with people who were left in worse condition than they started because well-meaning but untrained individuals tried to cast out something they had no authority over and no preparation to face. The demonic is not impressed by enthusiasm. It is not moved by sincerity alone. It responds to one thing: the authority of Jesus Christ operating through a properly ordained minister of his church in a state of grace with the protection of the full sacramental life behind him. That is the structure. That is the armor. Remove any piece of it and you are exposed in ways you cannot imagine. I want to spend the next several parts of this talk going deeper. I want to tell you what these things actually are, how they get in, what they want, what I have personally witnessed that most priests will carry to their graves without saying publicly, and most importantly, what you can do to protect yourself and your family. Because this is not just a problem for people who end up in a hospital bed unable to speak their own name. This is happening in ordinary homes to ordinary people, through ordinary-looking doors that most of us open without a second thought. One of the most dangerous lies that modern culture has accepted is this: that you have to do something dramatic to invite a demonic influence, that you have to join a cult or perform some kind of dark ritual or explicitly reject God in some formal ceremony. That is not how it works. That is almost never how it works in my experience across hundreds of cases involving people from every background, every age. Well, every level of education and social standing. The vast majority of severe demonic cases I have encountered began with something small, something that felt harmless, something the person barely even remembered doing. The door doesn't usually blow open. It cracks open slowly over time. Let me give you some of the most common entry points that I have documented repeatedly in my casework. The occult, even casual contact. I am talking about people who went to one psychic reading as a joke at a bachelorette party, people who used a Ouija board once in college and threw it away, people who had their tarot cards read at a fair and thought nothing more of it. The church teaches, and my experience confirms, that these practices are not neutral entertainment. They are an explicit act of seeking knowledge or power from a source other than God, and that act creates an opening may lie dormant for years, but it is there sexual sin, especially habitual sexual sin. I know this is not what people want to hear, but the demonic exploits the sacred specifically because it was designed to be sacred. Human sexuality in its proper context is a participation in the creative power of God. The demons know this. And they pursue its corruption with obsessive focus. People are trapped in pornography, addiction, in fornication, in various forms of sexual disorder. I have seen repeatedly that these states of habitual sin thin the spiritual protection around a person in ways that make them significantly more vulnerable. Unforgiveness and deep-seated rage. The demonic has legal access, and I use that term deliberately because the church's theology of the demonic actually uses the language of rights and permissions. The demonic has what amounts to legal access to souls that are held in bondage by rage, hatred, and unforgiveness. When a person refuses to forgive, truly refuses as an act of will, They are holding themselves in a state of spiritual contraction that the darkness uses as leverage generational sin. This is perhaps the most misunderstood category. In my exorcism work, one of the first things I investigate is family history, not because of some pseudoscientific genetic determinism, but because the demonic operates through covenants, whether explicit or implicit, and those covenants can pass through family lines until they are broken by the authority of Christ. I have had cases where the affliction in the person I was working with traced back to an ancestor's deliberate involvement in Freemasonry or witchcraft, or a blood pact that was made generations ago. The original person is long dead, but the attachment persists until it is renounced, rebuked, and severed by proper spiritual authority. I want to pause here and address something because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, this sounds medieval. This sounds like superstition. This sounds like the kind of thing that science has moved past. And I want to respond to that directly. I am a trained philosopher. I have studied epistemology. I understand the difference between evidence and anecdote. I am not asking you to believe me because I say so. I am asking you to look at what we actually know about human consciousness and notice that materialist science cannot explain it. We do not have a scientific account of how physical matter produces subjective experience. We do not have a scientific account of near-death experiences where patients accurately report conversations and events that occurred while they were clinically dead. We do not have a scientific account of the documented physical phenomena in genuine possession cases, phenomena that have been witnessed by teams of medical doctors who have no stake in a religious conclusion. The Jesuit priest, Dr. Herbert Thurston, documented dozens of such cases in the early 20th century. The contemporary psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gallagher, a Columbia-trained Yale-affiliated academic, has publicly stated that he has witnessed cases that in his clinical judgment cannot be explained by any known psychiatric or neurological mechanism. He is not a credulous man. He is one of the most credentialed psychiatrists in the country, and he says this is real. Now, back to the doors. What I want you to understand is that most people who come to me are not wicked people. They are often good people. People who love their families, people who go to Mass, people who try to live decent lives. But somewhere either in their own history or in the history of those who came before them, a door was opened and no one knew how to close it. That is what we are going to talk about in part 3. What happens when you are in the room, what I have personally witnessed that I have never spoken about on camera before, and what the Church's exorcism rite is actually designed to do at its deepest theological level. The things that have been said to me in those rooms, the things they know, the things they reveal against their own will when the authority of Christ presses them, it is going to disturb you. I apologize in advance, but you need to know this. I need to be careful here, not because I am afraid of what I'm about to say, but because I take the privacy and dignity of the people I have served very seriously. So, I will describe composite elements, patterns I have observed across multiple cases without revealing anything that would identify an individual, but I will not soften it. You need the truth. The first thing that strikes you in a genuine possession case is the smell. It is difficult to describe to someone who has never encountered it. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the smell of something organic, something that should be living in a state of deep corruption. But beneath that, there is something else, something chemical and ancient. Sulfur is the word that gets used, and it is not inaccurate, but it does not fully capture it. It is a smell that makes the primitive part of your brain, the part that recognizes danger below the level of conscious thought, go silent and still. Your body knows something is wrong before your mind processes it. The second thing is the eyes. I have spoken to colleagues about this and we have all noticed the same thing. In genuine cases, there comes a moment in the rite where the entity becomes fully manifest, where it stops hiding behind the person's normal presentation and reveals itself. In that moment, the eyes change. They don't roll back. They don't go red like in the movies. They go flat. The light that is normally present in a human eye, the quality of presence of being home behind the eyes goes out. And what looks back at you is something that is not human and has never been human. Wearing a human face. I cannot overstate how disorienting this is. Every instinct you have from a lifetime of social interaction is trained to read meaning from human faces. Your entire social brain is built around interpreting what you see in another person's eyes. When that reference disappears, when you look into eyes that have none of that quality, there is a vertigo that happens, a deep wrongness that no amount of training fully prepares you for. The third thing, and this is the one that changed my theology more than anything else I have ever experienced, is what they say when they are being pressed by the authority of the right. The Church's rite of exorcism includes commands, prayers, and commands addressed directly to the demonic that require it to identify itself, to reveal its legal claims, and to depart. What most people don't know is that these commands sometimes work in unexpected directions. Demons, when pressed by legitimate spiritual authority, sometimes reveal things that they clearly don't want to reveal. They are compelled. I have had a demon under the pressure of the right involuntarily confess sins of the possessed person that no one in the room knew about. Sins that the person had never confessed, never told anyone. And that confession, involuntary, extracted against the demon's will, was the key to breaking the legal hold it had established. Think about what that means theologically. It means that the demonic can hold a person in bondage through unconfessed, unrepented sin. That sin creates a legal right, a permission, a foothold that gives it access. And the only way to close that door is through sacramental confession, through genuine repentance, through the absolution that only an ordained priest can give in the name of Jesus Christ. I have watched people walk into that room barely able to speak their own name, convulsing, screaming in voices that weren't theirs, physically restrained, and walk out afterward. Sometimes slowly over multiple sessions, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with an abruptness that leaves everyone in the room stunned into silence. The transformation is not gradual, it is decisive. Because when the legal right is removed, the presence has no authority to remain. There is one case that I return to in my mind more than any other. A woman in her late 30s, multiple psychiatric evaluations, multiple diagnosis, multiple medications, none of which had touched the core problem. When I first met her, she looked at me with those flat eyes and said in a voice that was not hers, in a language she did not speak, the name of my confessor, not my bishop, my personal confessor. A private relationship that is by its nature sealed and hidden. That is not a thing a human being could know by accident. That is not a thing that can be explained by reading my correspondence or researching my background. That is knowledge that had to come from something that was watching, something that had been watching me specifically, cataloging what it knew, waiting for a moment to use it. It said my confessor's name to unsettle me, to make me feel exposed, to break my concentration and create doubt. And I want to be honest, it worked for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds where I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A cold that went all the way down. And then I picked up where I left off. Because the one thing I know, the one thing that 20 years of this work has burned into me at the level of bone is this. It knows my confessor's name. And my confessor's power to absolve me comes from the same Christ who created these beings and will ultimately judge them. That name they cannot use. That name they can only flee. We'll go deeper in Part 4 into what the demonic hierarchy actually looks like and why it matters for your own spiritual life. Because what happens in those rooms is not separate from what happens in your living room. It is the same war, just at different intensities. Most people think of the demonic as a vague, undifferentiated force, a kind of spiritual static dark energy without structure or order. This is completely wrong. And understanding why it is wrong is one of the most practically useful things I can teach you about protecting yourself and your family. The demonic is hierarchical. It is organized. Watts. It operates with a chain of command that St. Thomas Aquinas, drawing on Scripture, and the Church Fathers described in precise theological terms. Pseudo-Dionysius, whose work on the celestial hierarchy shaped Catholic angelology for centuries, lays out a structure that corresponds remarkably closely to what I have observed operationally in exorcism cases. There are different classes of demonic beings with different degrees of power, different areas of specialization, and different degrees of attachment they are capable of forming with human beings. At the lower end are what we might call oppression spirits, entities whose primary mode of operation is external harassment, disturbances in the home, unusual sounds, objects moved, a persistent sense of being watched or followed, unusual run of bad luck, accidents, relational conflict that seems to come from nowhere and resist every practical solution. These lower entities are the most commonly encountered and, relatively speaking, the most easily addressed by simple, consistent sacramental practice. I say, relatively speaking, I don't want to minimize it. Even these lower-order oppression states can be genuinely debilitating. I have worked with families where children couldn't sleep, marriages were collapsing, deteriorating, health was deteriorating, all of which cleared when the spiritual root cause was properly addressed. Above these are what the tradition calls infestation entities, spirits attached to a location rather than or in addition to a person, houses, property, objects. Yes, objects. I have dealt with cases where an object brought into a home from a garage sale or an antique market or an inheritance from a relative who was involved in a cult practice served as a point of attachment for something that then made the entire household miserable. This is not superstition. The Church has prayers and rites specifically for the blessing and cleansing of objects and places precisely because the tradition recognized very early that these attachments are real and need to be properly addressed. Then there are the higher order entities, the ones involved in cases of full possession. These are not random opportunists. They are, in my observation, almost always there because a specific door was opened, often long ago, often by someone in the family line, rather than the person currently suffering. They have a legal claim they were invited in at some point by someone's free choice, and they are extremely reluctant to leave because they understand that their presence, it depends on that claim remaining unchallenged. One of the things that has shocked me most consistently in this work is how organized their strategy is. These entities do not simply attack, they plan. In multiple cases, I have discerned through the rite, through spiritual direction with the person involved, and through careful reconstruction of the timeline that the demonic had been operating in a family across multiple generations, systematically working to prevent certain members from reaching certain sacraments at critical moments, steering people away from confession at key moments, creating circumstances not through magic, but through the exploitation of human weakness and natural circumstances that led to the breakdown of faith and the opening of further doors. It is a long game, and they are patient in a way that no human adversary is patient because they are not bound by time the way we are. Now, what does this mean for you sitting in your home watching this video? Means that spiritual warfare is not something that happens to extraordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It is the baseline condition of every human life. The difference is the degree of awareness and the degree of active spiritual engagement. St. Peter didn't write his first letter to exorcists, he wrote it to ordinary Christians. And he wrote, "Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour." This is not a metaphor. This is an operational description of a reality that every baptized person lives inside of, whether they acknowledge it or not. The baptized person who lives a sacramentally active life, who goes to confession regularly, who receives the Eucharist in a state of grace, who prays daily, who is in a properly ordered relationship with the Church, that person is not invulnerable, but they are substantially protected. The grace that flows through those sacraments builds what I sometimes describe as a kind of spiritual immune system. It doesn't mean nothing can touch you. It means the defenses are functioning and the body, the soul, has the resources to fight. The person who has drifted, who was baptized but has not been to confession in years, who has allowed habitual sin to become the wallpaper of their life, who has dabbled in spiritual practices that are not ordered to God, that person is walking around with compromised defenses and the things that can exploit that. No, I am not saying this to cause fear. I am saying this because fear is not the appropriate response. Vigilance is the appropriate response, and vigilance requires knowledge. In part 5, well, I want to tell you what has never been said publicly, what I have witnessed in the right, that tells us something specific and practically important about how God's grace operates in these moments. Because the story of exorcism is not ultimately about the darkness, it is about the power that overcomes it. And what I have seen of that power is, if anything, more shocking than what I have seen of the darkness itself.